ESG, which is environment, social, and governance, has been at the forefront of the North American oil patch for the last couple of years now. And Raymond James has issued a very interesting report on how Canada stacks up, or how Canadian oil patch management perceives ESG versus their US peers. So we're going to talk to Jeremy McCrae about that, and welcome to the interview, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start with just an overview of the study, please?
Sure. So every quarter for the last few years, the Dallas Fed has conducted a survey with its US energy operators. And there's been more and more institutional investors who are following this survey because it really gives an insight into terms of how US operators are thinking about the business, the sector, what they're planning to do, for the next year. And it gives a little bit more insight in terms of what companies are thinking versus on an anonymous basis, which really does give some more clear-cut ways of how they're really thinking. And we ended up having a lot of institutional investors ask us if there was any kind of similar survey up in Canada, on which there wasn't. But just given our contacts with a large part of the public and private companies here, we thought, let's just go send out a similar survey using the similar questions to Canadian operators and see what we get back. So this was the first time we've done that. We got about an 86% hit rate back in terms of the 65 operators that we sent the survey to. So it really gives a good indication of how Canadian operators are thinking about the same thing here.
Now, one of the conclusions that really stuck out from this survey for me was that the Canadians are actually, Canadian managers of these companies are far more committed and have plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions than their American counterparts. And it was really, the percentages are quite striking.
Yeah, so in the US, when the Dallas Fed asked that question, 70% of US operators said they have no plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You look at that in Canada, only 16% of US or Canadian operators said they had no plans. More importantly, though, if you ask how much do you plan to reduce your emissions by more than 10%, you had 52% of Canadian operators said they plan to do that more than 10%, were only 6% of US operators. So a huge difference between the forward thinking of Canadian management teams versus US operators.
Now, I'm going to take a guess here, but I would assume that a lot of that has to do with climate policy at both the federal and provincial level, but also the increasing scrutiny that institutional investors are focusing on this sector. And they're essentially, if you want my money, you have to have a plan to reduce your emissions. Is that a fair comment?
No, that's 100% fair. For the last few years, as regulations started to come more and more in effect, a lot of Canadian E&P operators have been focusing on this issue now for the last few years. It's become ingrained within their board culture, and they do have a much more, concrete plan to looking at how to reduce emissions, where I think a lot of the US operators have still been focusing on how do we grow, let's just keep on drilling more and more, and aren't taking this bit more holistic approach to the long-term sustainability of what investors are looking for nowadays.
Well, let's talk about Canadian companies' ability to access capital. I was reading Alberta Securities and Exchange Commission report from December 2019 that showed that Canadian public companies have had a really, really hard time accessing capital. I think it was almost zero in 2018. It was $1 billion in 2019, which is really a drop in the bucket. And the small companies were experiencing the biggest difficulty. Is that still the case?
It is. Optimism that is quickly coming back into the sector.
Jeremy, can I get you to, just as you began to answer, your screen froze up. And could I get you to answer that question again, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. Things are changing very, very quickly here. And as commodity prices, especially Canadian power prices, are getting back to levels we haven't seen now, for the last couple of years. Gas prices are improving. All at the same time, your your costs to drill wells and your operating costs have come down, the profitability for this sector has never been better, probably for the last 4 or 5 years. And that is really starting to turn the attention from a lot of investors who haven't been participating in this sector here. You're starting to see the share prices really start to move here higher. And that's, you haven't seen much action quite yet, but it sounds when we talk to different management teams that there is some keenness on potentially looking to get more institutional investors involved in their stock here, and that's through, do we need to consolidate? Do we need to maybe take on some more term debt? And overall, your cost of capital is definitely improving for the sector here.
Final question, Jeremy. Your study also noticed that small companies are adding workers, and I guess that's good news. But unfortunately, the large companies are not. They're still reducing headcount. And by my calculation, the large operators account for about 80% of the oil that's produced in Alberta. And any particular reason why the discrepancy between the small and the large operators?
For the last few years, the environment that a lot of operators operated in here in Canada was very difficult. So you saw the private and smaller public companies make headcount cuts much sooner than the larger companies. The larger companies said, we can make it through this downturn. I think they're realizing this is taking much longer and there is going to be a structural change in the business. But I think a lot of the smaller companies are making big strides in terms of their profitability. And as a result, they have the ability to now start hiring again from the cuts that they made in the past. And I think you look at the outlook questions in our survey, 88% of them had a much more favorable outlook today versus last quarter. And that's what's being reflected of, our profitability is better. We can start to look at the hiring a few more guys to expand some of these projects here. And so that's the discrepancy that you're seeing between some of the smaller companies and the public companies who still haven't, fully readjusted from some of the structural changes that we've seen.
Jeremy, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.